Some discoveries don't fully make sense. Objects that were never meant to last, but did. Tools, burials, and structures that show a level of understanding far beyond what we expect from their time. From skulls that were operated on while people were still alive, to stones carved with precision, to objects that still function even after thousands of years. These are real discoveries. Documented, studied, and still not completely explained. In this video, we're going through some of the most unusual ancient finds ever uncovered, and the deeper you go, the more questions start to appear. If you enjoy content like this, make sure to subscribe before we begin, and let me know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? Because some of these might stay in your mind longer than you expect. The skull that was opened while alive. Brain surgery. Thousands of years ago. It sounds like something that belongs in a modern hospital, surrounded by sterile tools, advanced imaging, and trained specialists who understand every layer of the human body. Is the kind of procedure that depends on precision, knowledge, and controlled conditions. But the evidence suggests something very different. Because long before modern medicine, long before structured medical education, or written anatomical studies, there were people who were already attempting one of the most dangerous procedures imaginable, opening the human skull. And not by accident. Not through injury, but deliberately. What archaeologists have uncovered are human skulls with carefully made openings, shapes that are too controlled to be random damage, too consistent to be explained as natural fractures, and too precise to be dismissed as simple impact wounds. This practice is known as trepanation, and it appears in multiple parts of the world, across different time periods, suggesting that it was not an isolated discovery, but something that was understood, repeated, and possibly even taught. At first, the reaction to these skulls is usually the same: confusion. Because the idea that ancient people would attempt something like this feels difficult to accept. It challenges the assumption that complex medical procedures are a relatively recent development. But the more closely these skulls are studied, the more the initial confusion begins to shift into something else: recognition. Because the marks on the bone are not random, they show control. In many cases, the edges of the openings are smooth, shaped gradually, rather than broken through force, indicating that the procedure was likely done using scraping or drilling techniques rather than blunt impact. And that matters, because it suggests intention. It suggests that the person performing the procedure was not just trying something blindly, but following a method, applying a technique that had likely been used before. And then there is the most important detail: healing. Because around many of these openings, there is clear evidence of bone regrowth, a process that only occurs if the individual survived the procedure long enough for the body to begin repairing itself, which means this wasn't always fatal. In fact, in some cases, survival seems to have been common enough that the practice continued. And that raises a much bigger question. How were they doing this successfully? Because even with modern knowledge, opening the skull carries serious risks, including infection, bleeding, and damage to the brain itself. And without anesthesia, without sterile environments, without modern tools, those risks would have been even greater. But survival suggests that something about their method worked. Possibly not in every case, but often enough to matter. The tools they used were simple by modern standards: stone, bone, early metal in later periods. But simplicity does not always mean inefficiency, because a tool does not need to be complex to be effective. It needs to be controlled. And control is what these skulls show. Some of the openings are small, others larger, some circular, others more irregular. But many share a common feature. They avoid the most dangerous areas. They are placed in locations that suggest awareness of where not to cut, which may indicate that the people performing the procedure had at least a basic understanding of which areas of the skull were safer to work on. And that understanding may not have come from formal study, it may have come from experience, observation, trial and error, which is often how early knowledge develops. not through written theory, but through repeated practice. And that leads to another important point. This was not a one-time event. In some cases, multiple openings appear on the same skull, suggesting that the procedure was performed more than once on the same individual, which means not only did they survive the first attempt, but they were considered stable enough to undergo it again. And that changes everything. Because now this is not just an extreme act, it becomes a form of treatment, a repeated intervention, something that people relied on. But the purpose behind it is still debated. One explanation is medical. That trepanation was used to treat head injuries, particularly those that cause pressure within the skull, such as swelling or bleeding. And in those cases, creating an opening could relieve that pressure, potentially preventing further damage. And that idea is supported by some of the evidence, because certain skulls show signs of trauma alongside the trepanation, suggesting that the procedure may have been performed in response to injury. But there is another possibility, a different kind of explanation, because in many early cultures, illness was not always understood as purely physical, especially when it affected behavior, perception, or consciousness. Conditions that we now associate with neurological or psychological causes may have been interpreted differently, possibly as spiritual disturbances, possession, or imbalance. And in that context, opening the skull may have been seen not just as a physical act, but as a way to release something, to remove whatever was believed to be causing the condition. And that interpretation may sound distant from modern understanding, but it reflects a different way of thinking about the body, one that connects physical and non-physical explanations rather than separating them. And the two explanations are not necessarily exclusive, because a procedure can have a practical effect and still be understood in symbolic terms. It can work even if the reasoning behind it is different. And that overlap may explain why trepanation continued, because if people saw results, if survived, if symptoms changed, then the practice would have been reinforced regardless of the explanation behind it. And that reinforcement leads to continuity, to repetition, to the spread of the technique, which is exactly what we see. Because trepanation is not limited to a single culture. It appears in South America, in Europe, in parts of Africa, in Asia, across different times, different environments, different societies. And yet, the core idea remains the same. Opening the skull, in a controlled way, with a purpose, and that consistency is what makes it significant. Because it shows that this was not an isolated curiosity. It was a shared solution to a problem, even if the understanding of that problem varied. And even now, when you look at these skulls, the evidence is still there, clear, undeniable. The openings, the healed bone, the signs that someone made a decision to attempt something extremely difficult. And that decision required more than just tools. It required belief, confidence, willingness to act in a situation where the outcome was uncertain. And that is what stands out. Not just the procedure itself, but the intention behind it. Because this represents one of the earliest examples of humans trying to intervene directly in the body, not passively accepting illness or injury, but attempting to change it, to fix it, to improve the outcome. And that attempt, even without modern knowledge, shows something important, that the drive to understand and treat the human body is not new. It has been there for a very long time. The tiny coffins hidden in a cave, 17 miniature coffins, no explanation. At first, it sounds like something insignificant. Small objects, easily overlooked, something that could be dismissed as decoration or a simple craft. But the moment you see them, that assumption starts to fall apart. Because these weren't random objects. They were deliberate, carefully made, and hidden. The discovery was made in the 19th century, near Arthur's seat in Edinburgh, a place already known for its unusual landscape and long history. But what was found there didn't match anything expected. Inside a small cave, tucked away and out of sight, a group of miniature coffins had been placed, arranged in a way that suggested intention rather than accident. There were 17 of them, each one small, carved from wood, shaped like a coffin, and containing a tiny human figure placed inside, laid out in a way that closely resembles burial practices, just on a much smaller scale. And that detail is what changes everything, because this wasn't just about making objects. It was about recreating something real, a burial, but in miniature. And that immediately raises a question. Why? Because making one could be explained as symbolic, a single object representing something specific. But 17 suggests repetition, a pattern, something that was done multiple times with consistency. And consistency usually means purpose. Each coffin was slightly different, not identical, but clearly part of the same idea. The figures inside were carved with simple detail, dressed in small pieces of fabric, placed within the coffins in a way that suggests care rather than randomness. And that care matters, because it shows intention, not something done quickly, not something thrown together, but something made piece by piece and then placed deliberately inside a hidden space. And that space is important, because the coffins were not displayed. They were not meant to be seen easily. They were concealed, placed within a cave, away from open view, suggesting that whatever their purpose was, it did not depend on being observed by many people, which changes how we think about them. Because now this is not public. It is private. And private actions often carry different meanings, different reasons. Some interpretations suggest that these coffins were connected to burial practices, possibly symbolic representations of real individuals who could not be buried properly, perhaps due to circumstances where bodies were not recovered or could not be returned. And that idea has some weight, because during certain periods, especially in the 19th century, there were events and conditions where proper burial was not always possible, and symbolic acts were sometimes used as substitutes. But the number still raises questions. 17 is specific, not random. And it does not directly match a well-known single event, which makes the explanation incomplete. Another idea connects them to folklore, to beliefs that existed at the time about spirits, about protection, about creating objects that could represent or contain something beyond the physical. And in that context, the coffins could have served a different purpose, not as representations of the dead, but as something meant to influence the unseen. And that idea is harder to confirm, because it relies on interpretation, on understanding belief systems that were not always recorded clearly. And that leaves space for uncertainty. There is also the possibility that they were created by an individual, not a group. Someone who repeated the same act over time, making each coffin separately, adding to the collection, and eventually placing them together in a single location. And that idea introduces another layer, because now it becomes personal, an action repeated, a pattern created, but without explanation. And that lack of explanation is what keeps the mystery alive, because there are no clear records that describe why these coffins were made, no direct connection to a known tradition, no single explanation that fits every detail. And that means we are left with the objects themselves and what they show. They show effort, they show repetition, they show intention, and they show placement, all of which point to something meaningful, but not something fully understood. Over time, some of the coffins were damaged, some lost, but many still remain, preserved, studied, examined, yet still not fully explained. And even now, when you look at them, the effect is the same. They feel deliberate, too specific to be random, too consistent to be accidental, and too unusual to ignore. Because small objects often don't carry this kind of weight, but these do, because they represent something that mattered enough to be made, repeated, and hidden. And maybe that is what makes them stand out. Not because are large, not because they are complex, but because they are precise in a way that suggests intention without explanation. And that is where the mystery stays. not in what we can see, but in what we still don't know. The shoe that shouldn't have survived. It looks like it was worn yesterday. That's the first thing people notice. Not the age, not the location, but how normal it looks. Because when you see it, there's nothing about it that immediately suggests thousands of years have passed. The shape is familiar. The stitching is visible. The material still holds its form. It looks like something that could still be used. And that's what makes it difficult to process. Because this shoe was not made recently. It was found in a cave in Armenia, in a place known as Arini One. And when it was discovered, it was already thousands of years old, dating back more than 5,000 years. And yet, it remained. Not as fragments, not as an outline, but almost complete. And that kind of preservation is rare, because materials like leather do not usually survive that long. They decay, they break down, they disappear over time, especially in environments where moisture, bacteria, and temperature changes are present. But this environment was different. The cave conditions were dry, stable, protected. And that made all the difference. Because instead of breaking down, the material was preserved, held in a state that allowed it to remain recognizable, almost unchanged in appearance. And that preservation gives us something unusual, a direct connection, not to a structure, not to a tool, but to something personal, something worn, used, part of daily life. The shoe itself is simple in design, made from a single piece of leather, shaped around the foot, with laces that would have tightened it into place. And that simplicity is important, because it shows practicality, not decoration, not excess, just function. Something made to be worn, to protect, to last. And it did. But what stands out is not just the survival of the object. It's how familiar it feels. Because the design is not distant. It doesn't look primitive in the way people expect. It looks recognizable, close to what we use today. And that creates a different kind of connection, because instead of seeing it as something from a completely different world, it feels closer, more immediate, more human. And that changes how we think about the people who made it, because it suggests that their needs were not so different. They needed protection, comfort, durability, and they solved those needs in ways that are not entirely unfamiliar. The shoe also shows signs of use. It wasn't made and left behind. It was worn, creased, shaped by movement, and that detail matters, because it tells us that this was part of someone's life. Not an object made for display, but something used, repeatedly, and then left behind. But even that raises questions, because the shoe was found filled with grass, packed inside. And that could mean different things. It may have been used for insulation, to keep warmth, or to help maintain its shape when not being worn. And both possibilities suggest care, attention, understanding of how to use the object beyond just wearing it. And that adds another layer, because now this is not just about making something. It's about maintaining it, using it effectively, adapting it to conditions. And that reflects knowledge, not formal knowledge, but practical understanding, built through experience, and that experience is what connects everything. Because when you look at this shoe, you're not just seeing an object. You're seeing the result of choices. Material chosen. Shape decided. Method applied. All of it coming together to create something that worked. And continued to work. And that is why it survived. Not just physically, but conceptually. Because the idea behind it is still present. Still used, still relevant, and that is rare. Because most objects from that time feel distant. Abstract. Hard to relate to. But this doesn't. It feels immediate, as if the gap between then and now is smaller than expected. And maybe that is what makes it stand out. Not just the preservation, but the familiarity. Because it reminds us that even thousands of years ago, people were solving problems in ways that are not entirely different from how we solve them today. And that connection is what remains. The hand that was never meant to move. A hand possibly used in unknown rituals. At first it looks like a fragment, something broken off from a larger statue, a piece of something that once stood complete. But the more closely it's examined, the more that idea begins to fall apart. Because this is not a fragment, it was made this way, deliberately. A single hand, cast in bronze, shaped with detail that goes beyond what would be expected for something incomplete. With fingers formed carefully, proportions balanced, and a surface that shows intention rather than damage. This is the Prail bronze hand, and it is older than it looks, dating back more than 3,000 years. It comes from a time when working with bronze required skill, knowledge, and control. Because casting metal is not a simple process. It involves heat, molds, timing, and an understanding of how materials behave under conditions that are not easily corrected once something goes wrong, which means this was not accidental. It was made by someone who knew what they were doing. But the form itself raises questions, because it is not attached to anything. Not part of a full figure, not connected to a statue, just a hand. And that choice matters. Because objects are usually made to represent something whole. A person, a figure, a form. But here, only one part exists. And that suggests focus. Not on the body, but on the hand itself. And that shifts the meaning. Because hands carry symbolism. They represent action, control, presence. They are used to hold, to signal, to connect. And across different cultures, hands have often been used in symbolic ways, representing power, authority, or even something spiritual. And that possibility becomes stronger when you look at the details. Because this hand is not plain, it is decorated. On the wrist there is a band of gold, carefully applied, forming a contrast with the bronze, creating a visual distinction that draws attention to that part of the object. And that detail is not random, because adding gold requires additional effort, additional resources, and that suggests importance, because you don't add value to something unless it matters. And that leads to another question. What was it used for? Because an object like this does not appear functional in the usual sense. It is not a tool. It does not serve a clear practical purpose, which means its use was likely symbolic or ceremonial. And that idea is supported by where it was found. The hand was discovered buried alongside human remains, suggesting a connection between the object and the individual. But the exact nature of that connection is not fully clear. It could have been placed as part of a burial, a marker, a symbol, something that represented status or identity. Or it could have been something used during life, an object that held meaning before being placed in the ground. And both possibilities exist because the context does not fully explain the purpose, only the association. And that association is important because it shows that the object was not separate, it was connected to a person. But how it was used remains uncertain. There is also the question of construction, because the hand is hollow, not solid. And that detail changes how it may have been used, because a hollow structure could have been mounted, attached, or even held. And that opens up possibilities, because now it is not just an object. It becomes something that could interact with movement, with positioning, with display. And that suggests it may have been part of a larger system, not physically attached to a full statue, but functionally connected to something else, something that is no longer present. And that absence is what makes it difficult to fully understand, because we have the object, but not the complete context. And without that context, interpretation becomes limited, based on comparison, on pattern, on what is known from other sites, but not directly confirmed. And that is where the mystery remains, not in what the object is, but in what it meant, because we can see the craftsmanship, we can understand the material, we can analyze the structure, but the purpose behind it is not fully preserved. And that leaves space for interpretation, for questions, for possibilities that cannot be confirmed, but also cannot be dismissed. And even now, when you look at the hand, it feels intentional. Too precise to be random, too detailed to be decorative alone, and too specific in form to be meaningless, because it represents something, something chosen, something defined. Even if that definition is no longer fully known, and maybe that is what makes it stand out. Not because it is large, not because it is complex, but because it is focused, a single form, given attention, given value, and placed in a way that suggests it mattered, and that meaning is what remains. The wheel that refused to disappear, still intact after 5,000 years. That alone sounds unlikely, because wood doesn't usually last. It breaks down, it rots, it disappears long before anything close to that amount of time passes, especially in environments where moisture and microorganisms are present, where organic material is normally the first thing to vanish. And yet this one remained. It was discovered in the Ljubljana marshes in present-day Slovenia, preserved in a waterlogged environment that, instead of destroying it, protected it. The lack of oxygen slowed down the natural processes that would normally cause decay, allowing the wood to survive in a condition that still holds its original form. And what survived was not just a fragment, but a wheel, complete enough to understand, clear enough to study, and old enough to change how we think about early technology. Because this is considered one of the oldest wooden wheels ever found, dating back over 5,000 years, placing it in a time when many assumptions about human capability are still being reconsidered. At first glance, the design looks simple. A solid wooden disc, thick, rounded, with a central hole. But that simplicity is misleading, because making something like this requires more than just cutting wood into shape. It requires planning, understanding the material, and knowing how to create a form that can handle stress, weight, and movement without breaking. And that is where the detail becomes important. The wheel was not carved from a single piece. It was constructed, made from multiple planks joined together, carefully fitted and secured in a way that allows the structure to behave as one solid piece. And that method matters, because it shows knowledge, not just of shape, but of construction. Because wood expands, contracts, cracks under pressure, and building a wheel that can survive repeated use requires understanding those properties, even if that understanding is not written down in formal terms. The central opening is also precise, not rough, not uneven, but shaped in a way that suggests it was designed to fit onto an axle. And that connection is what turns a circular object into something functional. Because a wheel on its own is just a form. It becomes technology when it is part of a system. And that system includes the axle, the frame, and whatever it was attached to, most likely a form of cart or transport structure. And that implies movement, not just static use, but motion, which changes everything, because now this is not just an object, it represents a shift, a way of moving things more efficiently, of reducing effort, of increasing capacity, and that kind of shift has long-term impact. But what makes this wheel stand out is not just its age or its function, it's its survival. Because most early wooden tools and structures have disappeared, leaving behind only indirect evidence of their existence. But here, the object itself remains, allowing us to see it, measure it, understand it directly, and that direct evidence removes a level of uncertainty. Because instead of guessing how something might have been made, we can observe it, study the joins, examine the surface, understand the method, and that clarity matters, because it confirms that the idea of the wheel was not just conceptual at that time. It was already in use, already developed, already part of a working system, and that suggests that the knowledge behind it had already existed for some time before this particular example was created. Because innovations like this rarely appear fully formed. They develop, gradually, through trial, through adjustment, through repeated attempts. And by the time we see a version like this, it is likely not the first, but one of many. And that raises another question. How widespread was this knowledge? Because the wheel appears in different regions around similar periods, suggesting that the idea may have developed independently in multiple places, or spread through contact and exchange. And both possibilities are significant because they point to a level of connection or parallel development. That reflects how human innovation works, not isolated, but shared, or repeated under similar conditions. The wheel itself also shows signs of use. It was not made and left behind untouched. It was part of activity, part of a movement, part of daily life, and that detail matters because it tells us that this was not experimental. It was functional, used, relied upon, and then, at some point, it was left in a place where conditions allowed it to survive, which is rare, because most objects like this would have disappeared completely, leaving no trace. And that is what makes this discovery important, because it fills a gap between assumption and evidence, between theory and reality, because now we can see it, not just imagine it, and that changes how we understand the timeline of technological development, because it shows that even at that early stage, people were already solving complex problems. Not in abstract ways, but in practical ones, creating solutions that worked, that lasted, that were used repeatedly. And that is what this wheel represents, not just an object, but a moment. A point where understanding turned into application, where an idea became something physical, something that could move, carry, change how things were done. And that impact is still visible today, because the basic concept of the wheel has not changed. It has been improved, refined, adapted, but the core idea remains the same. And that continuity connects the past to the present in a very direct way. Because when you look at this wheel, you are not just looking at something old, you are looking at the early form of something that still exists, still used, still essential, and that connection is rare. Connection is because most ancient objects do not carry that kind of direct relevance, but this one does. And maybe that is what makes it stand out. Not just its age, not just its preservation, but its familiarity. Because it shows that even thousands of years ago, people were already thinking in ways that continue to shape the world today. And that idea is what remains. The bone that counted time, carved into bone. At first, it doesn't look like much. A small piece of bone, darkened with age, marked with a series of lines that seem irregular at a glance, almost like scratches made without a clear pattern. It doesn't immediately stand out as something important, and without context, it could easily be overlooked. But the moment you begin to look closer, the randomness starts to disappear, because the markings are not scattered. They are grouped, organized, placed in sequences that suggest intention rather than chance. This is the Ishango bone discovered near the border of what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, and it dates back more than 20,000 years, placing it far earlier than many of the systems we associate with structured counting or recorded time. And that is where the significance begins, because this is not just an object, it is a record, not written in words, but in marks, each line carved deliberately into the surface, creating a pattern that can be observed, analyzed, and interpreted, even if its exact meaning is not fully agreed upon. The bone itself is small enough to be held in one hand, which suggests that it was meant to be carried, used, interacted with, rather than placed permanently in a single location. That detail alone changes how we think about it, because it implies function, not decoration, not display, but use. And the markings reflect that use. They are arranged in columns, each grouping separated from the others, forming sequences that appear to follow certain numerical patterns. Some researchers have pointed out that the numbers represented by these marks may reflect doubling sequences or prime numbers or other forms of structured counting. And that possibility is important because it suggests that the people who created this were not simply marking randomly. They were tracking something, counting something, recording something in a way that could be, in a way, revisited and understood later. But what exactly they were tracking is still debated. One of the most widely discussed interpretations is that the bone may have been used as a kind of calendar, possibly linked to lunar cycles, with the markings representing days, phases, or intervals that repeat over time. And that idea fits, because early human societies would have been closely connected to natural cycles, observing patterns in the sky, changes in light, and the passage of time through environmental cues, and tracking those patterns would have been useful for movement, for hunting, for understanding seasons. But there are other interpretations as well. Some suggest that the bone may represent an early form of mathematical thinking, not tied directly to time, but to numbers themselves, a way of organizing and understanding quantity in a structured form. And that idea pushes the significance even further, because it suggests that abstract thinking, the ability to work with numbers beyond immediate physical objects, may have existed much earlier than often assumed. But the challenge is that there are no written explanations, no direct records that describe how this object was used, which means that all interpretations are based on the markings themselves, on patterns that can be observed but not definitively explained. And that creates uncertainty, because patterns can be read in different ways. What looks like a sequence to one interpretation may represent something else entirely. But even with that uncertainty, one thing remains clear. This was not random. The markings are too deliberate, too structured, too consistent. They show repetition, grouping, order. And those qualities suggest intention. Because random marks do not organize themselves, they do not form columns, they do not repeat in meaningful ways, and that intention is what makes the bone significant. Because it represents a step beyond immediate action, beyond reacting to the environment. It represents a recording, tracking, holding information outside the mind. And that is a major shift, because once information can be stored externally, even in a simple form like this, it can be returned to, built upon, shared. And that changes how knowledge develops. But the simplicity of the object also matters, because it shows that complex ideas do not require complex tools. A piece of bone, a sharp object, and the ability to make marks. That is all it took. And from that, something meaningful was created. Something that has lasted, not in function, but in form. Because even now, thousands of years later, the bone still carries its markings, still shows the patterns, still holds the record, even if we cannot fully read it. And that is where the mystery remains. Not in the object itself, but in its meaning. Because we can see what was done, we can observe the structure, but we cannot fully access the intention behind it. And that gap is what keeps it open to interpretation, to analysis, to continued interest. And maybe that is what makes the Ishango bone stand out. Not because it is large, not because it is visually striking, but because it represents something fundamental, the act of marking time, or number, or pattern, in a way that goes beyond memory. And that act is what remains. The adhesive that outlasted time. Tools still bonded after thousands of years. That detail sounds small at first, almost easy to ignore, because when we think about ancient tools, the focus usually goes to the stone itself, the sharp edge, the shape, the function. But what holds those pieces together is often overlooked, and in this case, that overlooked detail is exactly what makes it important. Because what archaeologists have found are tools where the stone and the handle are still connected, still bonded, even after thousands of years, and that bond is not natural, it was made, deliberately, using a substance that acted as an adhesive, often referred to as birch tar. At first glance, it doesn't look complex, dark, sticky, almost like a residue. But the process required to create it is anything but simple, because birch tar is not something that forms naturally in a usable way. It has to be produced. Through controlled heating of birch bark in low oxygen conditions, a process that requires understanding not just of fire, but of how to manipulate it, how to create the right environment where the material can break down and produce the substance without simply burning away. And that was where it becomes significant, because this is not accidental. This is chemistry. Not in the modern scientific sense with formulas and measurements, but in a practical sense where materials are transformed through controlled conditions to produce a new substance with specific properties. And those properties matter, because the adhesive is strong, flexible, durable. It can hold stone to wood. Maintain that bond through use, through movement, through time. And that kind of performance is not easy to achieve, even with modern materials, but here it was done, thousands of years ago. And that raises an important question. How did they figure this out? Because producing birch tar requires more than just placing bark in fire. If exposed directly to flames, the material burns. It disappears. To create tar, the process must limit oxygen, allowing the bark to heat and break down without fully combusting. And that means creating a controlled environment, possibly using covered pits, containers, methods that isolate the material from direct flame while still applying heat. And that suggests experimentation, trial, error, repeated attempts, because this is not something that would be discovered immediately. It requires observation, adjustment, understanding what works and what doesn't, and that process leads to knowledge, practical knowledge, not written, not formalized, but real, because it produces results, and those results are visible in the tools, because the bond holds, even now, which means it held then, during use, during movement, during the tasks it was made for. And those tasks matter, because tools are extensions of action. They are made to perform, to cut, to shape, to process materials. And for that, the connection between parts must be reliable. If the stone detaches, the tool fails. And failure in that context is not just inconvenient, it can be dangerous, which means the adhesive had to be trusted. It had to work consistently. And the fact that it was used suggests that it did. But this also reflects something deeper, because creating an adhesive is different from shaping stone. Stone tools rely on removing material, on shaping what already exists. But an adhesive is created, produced. It does not exist in usable form until it is made. And that shift represents a different kind of thinking, not just working with materials, but transforming them, changing them into something new. And that ability is significant because it shows an understanding of process, of cause and effect, of how conditions can be controlled to produce a desired outcome. And that kind of thinking is a foundation for many things that come later, but even without that broader context, the evidence is enough. Because the tools remain. The bond is still visible, still holding, still connecting materials that would otherwise separate. And that persistence is what stands out. Because time usually breaks things apart, separates components, reduces structures. But here, the connection remains. And that suggests that the method was effective. Not perfect, but reliable. And that reliability would have made a difference. Because a better tool is not just sharper, it is more stable, more consistent, more dependable. And that improves everything built around it. And that improvement accumulates. Because once a method works, it can be repeated, shared, adapted. And that leads to continuity, to development, to refinement. And even if the process was not fully understood in theoretical terms, it was understood in practice. And practice is often what matters most. Because it produces results, and those results can be observed, used, trusted. And that trust is what keeps something in use, across time, across generations. And even now, when these tools are examined, the adhesive is still there. Dark, solid, holding. A small detail, but one that carries a larger meaning. Because it shows that even at that early stage, people were not just shaping the world around them. They were altering it, creating new materials, new solutions, new ways of connecting things. And that connection is what remains. The sound that was never meant to be music creates sounds no modern instrument can match. At first it looks small, simple, almost like a toy, a carved piece of clay shaped in a way that doesn't immediately suggest anything unusual. with openings that resemble a basic whistle, something that should produce a clear, controlled tone. But the moment air moves through it, that expectation disappears. Because the sound is not clean, not musical, not controlled in the way modern instruments are designed to be. Instead, it is raw, distorted, unsettling, closer to a scream than a note, and that difference is what makes it stand out. Because this is not an instrument designed for melody. It does not follow the structure of music as we understand it today. It produces something else entirely. Something that feels intentional, but not in a way that is immediately comfortable. This is often referred to as the Aztec death whistle, and the name itself comes from the reaction it creates, because the sound it produces is difficult to ignore. It does not blend into the background, it cuts through it, and that suggests purpose, because objects that create sound are rarely made without intention, especially when the sound is this distinct, this specific, and this different from what we would expect. The construction of the whistle is more complex than it appears. Inside, the airflow is shaped in a way that disrupts the smooth passage of air, creating turbulence, which results in that distorted, layered sound. And that design is not accidental, because achieving that effect requires understanding how air moves, how it interacts with shape, how small changes in structure can alter the final output. And that suggests experimentation, because creating a sound like this is not something that happens by chance. It requires adjustment, testing, refinement, until the desired effect is achieved. And that effect is very specific. It does not sound like a standard whistle. It does not resemble a flute. It does not align with typical musical instruments. It produces something closer to a natural sound, something that resembles a human scream, or an animal call, or something in between. And that raises an important question. What was it used for? Because if it was not meant for music, then its purpose lies elsewhere. Some interpretations suggest that it may have been used in rituals, ceremonial contexts where sound plays a role not as entertainment, but as atmosphere, as something that influences perception, that creates a certain environment, that shifts the experience of those present, and in that context, a sound like this makes sense, because it is not calming, it is not structured, it is intense, and intensity can be used to signal, to represent, to evoke. Others suggest a different function, that it may have been used in warfare as a way to create fear, to produce a sound that is unfamiliar, unsettling, difficult to interpret, and therefore effective in disrupting the expectations of those who hear it. And that idea also fits, because sound has always been used as a tool, not just for communication, but for influence, for control, for psychological effect, and a sound like this would have been effective in that role. But there is no single confirmed explanation, because while the whistles have been found in archaeological contexts, including burial sites, there are no detailed records that describe exactly how they were used, what they represented, or what role they played in the society that created them, which means interpretation relies on the object itself, on the sound it produces, on the context in which it was found, and on comparison with other artifacts, and even with that the full picture remains incomplete. But what is clear is the level of design involved, because this is not a simple object. It is shaped, controlled, built to produce a specific effect, and that effect is consistent, which means the design was understood, not just discovered once, but repeated, recreated, which suggests that the knowledge behind it was shared, passed on, maintained. And that continuity reflects importance, because objects that are not valued are not repeated. They are not preserved in practice. They disappear. But this did not. It remained. And even now when it is tested, the sound is still there, unchanged, still producing the same effect, still carrying the same intensity. And that persistence connects the past to the present in a very direct way, because the experience of hearing it today is likely not very different from the experience of hearing it when it was first used. And that creates a rare kind of connection, because it allows us not just to see the object, but to experience part of what it does. And that experience is difficult to ignore, because it does not fit expectations. It challenges them. It shifts them. And that shift is what makes it memorable, because it does not behave the way we think it should. And that difference is where the meaning begins. Not fully explained, not completely understood, but clearly intentional. And maybe that is what makes it stand out. Not just the object itself, but the effect it creates. Because it shows that even in the past, people were not just making things to be seen or used in obvious ways, they were creating experiences, using sound, using design, using understanding, to produce something that goes beyond function. And that experience is what remains. The lock that understood security. Security. Thousands of years ago. It feels like something modern. A concept tied to keys, systems, controlled access, something designed to protect what matters from being opened by anyone who shouldn't have access. It's easy to associate that level of thinking with recent technology, with metal locks, precise mechanisms, and engineered systems. But the idea itself is much older, because long before modern locks existed, there were already systems designed to control access, to prevent entry, to create a clear distinction between what could be opened and what could not. And one of the earliest examples of that comes from ancient Egypt. At first, the mechanism appears simple, made mostly from wood, basic in material, but not in design, because what looks like a straightforward structure is actually a system of moving parts, working together in a way that requires the correct action to unlock it, and that is where it becomes significant. Because this is not just a barrier, it is a mechanism. The design is often described as a pin tumbler system, an early version of a concept that still exists in many modern locks today. Inside, there are pins that fall into place, blocking movement, preventing the bolt from sliding unless something lifts those pins into the correct position. And that something is the key. But the key itself is not small or simple like modern ones. It is large, wooden, shaped with protrusions that match the internal structure of the lock. And when inserted, those protrusions lift the pins, not randomly, but precisely, enough to allow the mechanism to move. And that precision is what defines the system. Because without the correct alignment, nothing happens. The lock remains closed. And that is the core idea of security. Not just blocking access, but requiring the right interaction to allow it. And that idea is already present here, thousands of years ago, which raises an important point. Because this is not just about building a door, it is about controlling who can open it. And that requires a different kind of thinking. Because now the focus is not only on structure, but on interaction, on creating a system that responds differently depending on how it is used. And that shift represents a significant step, because it moves from passive protection to active control. The materials used may seem simple. Wood, basic components. But the simplicity of material does not limit the complexity of design, because what matters is how the parts work together, how movement is restricted, how it is allowed, and under what conditions. And that system requires understanding, not just of materials, but of sequence, because the pins must be lifted before the bolt can move. The order matters, the positioning matters, and that reflects logical thinking, because this is essentially a problem being solved. How do you create a barrier that only opens under specific conditions? And the solution is not random. It is structured, it is repeatable, it is reliable. And reliability is what makes it useful. Because a lock that works sometimes is not effective. It has to work consistently. Every time. Otherwise the system fails. And the fact that this design was used suggests that it did work. Not perfectly, but well enough to be trusted. And trust is important because security systems depend on it. People rely on them to protect something valuable. And that implies that there was something worth protecting, which leads to another layer. Because a lock only exists if there is a reason for it. Something to secure. Something to control access to. And that suggests organization, ownership, value. Because without those concepts, there is no need for a lock. And that reflects a level of social structure, where resources, spaces, or objects are not open to everyone, where access is limited, defined, controlled. And that control is enforced through design, through a mechanism. And that mechanism becomes part of daily life, part of how people interact with space, with property, with each other. And even though the materials and scale may differ from modern systems, the underlying idea is the same. A controlled interaction, a required input, a specific condition that must be met before access is granted. And that continuity is what makes this significant, because it shows that the concept of security is not new. It has existed for thousands of years, evolving, changing in form, but not in principle. And even now, when examples of these ancient locks are examined, the mechanism is still understandable, still functional in concept. And because the design is clear, the parts are visible, the logic is present, and that clarity allows us to see not just what it is, but how it works. And understanding how it works is what connects it to the present. Because modern locks, despite their complexity, still follow similar principles. Alignment, control, restriction, release, all based on the correct interaction. And that connection shows that the idea was strong enough to last, to be adapted, to be improved, but not replaced entirely, because the core solution was already effective. And that is what remains, not just an object, but a system, a way of thinking, a solution to a problem that continues to exist. And maybe that is what makes it stand out, not just its age, but its relevance. Because it shows that even thousands of years ago, people were already thinking about security in ways that are still familiar today. And that idea is what remains. The burial that was not left empty. A grave that still carries the scent of life. At first it sounds impossible because when we think about ancient burials, we imagine bones, stone, and silence. Something stripped down by time, where only the most durable elements remain and everything else has disappeared. But this discovery suggested something different, something softer, something unexpected. Because inside a cave in what is now northern Iraq, in a place known as Shanidar, archaeologists uncovered a burial that appeared to contain more than just human remains. A burial where traces of pollen were found in unusually high concentrations around the body, suggesting that flowers may have once been placed there. And that detail changes the entire interpretation, because placing flowers is not practical. It does not protect the body. It does not preserve anything. It serves no functional purpose in the physical sense. It is symbolic. And symbolism implies intention is beyond survival. The individual found in this burial is believed to be a Neanderthal, dating back tens of thousands of years, which immediately challenges older assumptions about what Neanderthals were capable of. Because for a long time, they were often portrayed as lacking complex thought, lacking emotional depth, existing primarily through instinct rather than reflection. But this burial suggests something else, because if flowers were deliberately placed around the body, then the act was not random. It was chosen, and that choice implies meaning. The pollen itself does not remain as flowers. It survives in microscopic form, preserved in the soil, and it was through careful analysis that researchers identified clusters that were not evenly distributed, but concentrated in ways that suggest they were brought in and placed rather than scattered naturally. And that distinction is important because caves are not sealed environments. Wind, animals, movement, all of these can introduce external materials, but random distribution looks different. It spreads, it disperses, it does not gather in a focused pattern around a single location. And that focused pattern is what led to the interpretation that flowers may have been intentionally placed. But even with that interpretation, there is debate. Some researchers have suggested alternative explanations, including the possibility that burrowing animals could have introduced pollen into the area, creating a pattern that appears intentional but may not be. And that uncertainty is part of the story. Because archaeological evidence is rarely absolute, it is interpreted, compared, questioned, and sometimes revised. But even with those alternative explanations, the idea of intentional burial remains strong, because the body itself was placed in a way that suggests care, positioned within the ground rather than left exposed, indicating that the act of burial was deliberate, and that alone carries meaning. Because burial is not necessary for survival. It is a choice, an action that reflects how a group responds to death. And different responses suggest different ways of understanding life. If the burial included flowers, then it suggests an additional layer. Not just the act of placing the body, but the act of adding something to it. Something that does not serve a physical function, but may serve an emotional or symbolic one. And that introduces a deeper question. What did they understand about death? Because placing flowers suggests recognition. Recognition that something has changed, that something has ended, and that the individual who once existed still holds significance even after that change. And that recognition is complex. It goes beyond instinct. It involves awareness, memory, connection. And that is what makes this discovery important. Because it challenges the idea that complex emotional or symbolic behavior is limited to modern humans. It suggests that earlier groups may have had their own ways of expressing meaning, even if those ways are not recorded in language or preserved in written form. The cave environment also plays a role, because Shanidar Cave provided conditions that allowed these traces to remain, protected enough for evidence to survive, even if only partially, giving us a glimpse into something that would otherwise have disappeared completely. And that glimpse is incomplete, because we do not see the flowers themselves, we see what remains of them. We interpret based on patterns, based on distribution, based on comparison, and that leaves space for uncertainty. But it also leaves space for possibility, because even if every detail cannot be confirmed, the overall picture suggests that this was not a simple event. It was not just a body left behind, it was a body placed, possibly surrounded by elements that carried meaning. And that meaning may have been shared, because burial practices are rarely individual actions. They are usually part of a group behavior. Something repeated, something understood, something that reflects how a community responds. And that response tells us something about them. Not just how they lived, but how they understood loss. And that understanding is not easily measured. It does not leave clear physical evidence in the way tools or structures do. It appears indirectly, through actions, through patterns, through choices that leave traces behind. And that is what we see here. A set of choices, a body placed, possibly flowers added, a moment that reflects something beyond necessity, something that suggests awareness, connection, and maybe even care. And that is what remains. Not certainty, but indication. Not full explanation, but evidence of something more than simple survival. Because even in a time far removed from modern life, there are signs that people were not only living, but also responding to death in ways that carry meaning. And that meaning is what stays with us. The edge that shouldn't be possible. Edges sharper than modern blades. That claim sounds exaggerated at first, because modern tools are designed with precision, engineered using advanced materials and technology that allow for extremely fine edges, often measured at microscopic levels. It feels unlikely that something from the distant past, created without those tools or that knowledge, could match or even exceed that level of sharpness. But the evidence suggests otherwise, because certain ancient tools, made from volcanic glass known as obsidian, have edges so fine that under magnification they appear smoother and sharper than many modern steel blades, capable of producing cuts that are incredibly clean, even at a microscopic scale. And that is where the surprise begins, because obsidian is not metal. It is a natural material, formed through the rapid cooling of lava, which prevents crystal structures from forming, resulting in a glass-like substance that breaks in a very specific way, creating edges that are extremely thin and sharp, But that natural property alone is not enough, because raw obsidian does not automatically become a tool. It has to be shaped, and shaping it requires skill. The process used is often referred to as knapping, where controlled force is applied to the material in a way that removes flakes, gradually refining the shape and creating a sharp edge along the surface. And this process is not random. It requires precision, because applying too much force in the wrong direction can shatter the material completely, while too little force will not produce the desired edge. And that balance takes practice, understanding, experience. Because the person shaping the tool has to anticipate how the material will respond, how each strike will affect the structure, and how to guide that process toward a specific result. And that result is not just a sharp edge, it is a controlled edge, one that can be used effectively, repeatedly. And that level of control suggests that this was not an isolated skill. It was developed, refined, passed on. Because tools like this appear in multiple regions, across different time periods, indicating that the knowledge of how to work with obsidian was not limited to a single group. And that widespread use reflects its value, because a sharper tool is not just better, it changes what is possible. It allows for more precise cutting, more efficient processing, cleaner results. And that matters in many contexts, from preparing food to working with other materials. But what makes obsidian particularly interesting is how its edge compares to modern blades. Under microscopic examination, the edge of an obsidian blade can be incredibly fine, sometimes measured at a level that is thinner than the edge of high-quality steel scalpels. And in some cases, modern surgical tools have even used obsidian for specific procedures, because the cuts it produces can be cleaner, causing less damage to surrounding tissue. And that comparison changes the perspective, because it shows that this is not just an ancient solution. It is an effective one, even by modern standards. But there are limitations. Obsidian is fragile. It can chip, break, lose its edge more easily than metal, which means it is not always practical for long-term use in demanding conditions. And that is why modern tools often rely on materials that balance sharpness with durability. But in its ideal state, obsidian represents something different, an extreme. The sharpest possible edge, even if it does not last as long. And that trade-off reflects understanding. Because using obsidian effectively means knowing its strengths and its weaknesses, choosing when to use it and when not to. And that choice is part of the knowledge, because tools are not just about what they can do. They are about when they are used, how they are applied, and that application is what gives them value. The presence of obsidian tools also suggests something about movement and exchange, because obsidian is not found everywhere. It comes from specific volcanic regions, which means that in many cases the material had to be transported, traded, or carried over distances to reach the places where it was used. And that indicates connection between groups, between locations. Because valuable materials tend to move, they are shared, exchanged. And that movement creates networks, even in early periods. And that adds another layer, because now the tool is not just a product of skill. It is also part of a system, a network of access and distribution. But even without that broader context, the object itself is enough. Because when you look at an obsidian blade, the edge is visible, clean, defined, precise. And that precision is not accidental. It is the result of deliberate action, repeated practice, understanding built over time. And that is what remains. Not just the material, but the method, the knowledge, the ability to take something natural and shape it into something that performs at a level that still stands out today. And maybe that is what makes it so compelling. Not because it is advanced in the way we think of modern technology, but because it achieves something exceptional using simple means. And that combination is what stays. The hands that refuse to fade. Someone left their mark forever. At first it looks simple, almost instinctive, like something anyone might do without thinking, placing a hand against a surface and leaving an impression behind. But the more you look at it, the more it begins to feel deliberate, repeated, and deeply intentional. Because these are not just one or two marks, there are hundreds. Spread across the rock walls of a cave in Argentina known as Cueva de las Manos, a place where the surface is covered with outlines of human hands, layered over each other, overlapping, repeating, creating a visual record that has remained for thousands of years. And that scale is what changes the meaning. Because a single handprint could be random, an isolated act, but hundreds suggest something else entirely. A pattern, a tradition, an action that was repeated over time, possibly by different individuals, possibly across generations, each adding their own mark to a surface that was already filled with others. The method used to create these prints is also important, because they were not made by simply pressing a hand covered in pigment against the wall, but often by placing the hand against the rock and blowing pigment around it, creating a negative image, where the shape of the hand remains uncolored while the surrounding area is filled. And that technique requires intention, because it involves preparation. Pigment must be created, applied, blown in a controlled way. And that suggests process, not spontaneity. Because repeating this method again and again requires knowledge of how to produce the effect consistently. And that consistency is visible. The shapes are clear, recognizable, uniform in method even if they vary in size and placement. And that variation matters, because not all the hands are the same. Some are larger, some smaller. Some appear to belong to adults, others possibly to younger individuals, and that range suggests participation, not by one person, but by many. And that introduces a social element, because this is not just an individual act, it is collective, a shared activity, something that people took part in. And that raises the question of purpose, because marking a surface like this is not necessary for survival. It does not provide food, it does not offer protection, it does not directly improve daily function, which means it serves another role, one that is harder to define. Some interpretations suggest that these handprints may have been part of a ritual, a symbolic act that carried meaning within the group, possibly connected to identity, presence, or belonging. Because leaving a mark is a way of saying something without words, a way of existing beyond the moment, of placing something of yourself into a space that remains after you are gone. And that idea is powerful, because it connects action with memory. But there are other possibilities as well. Some suggested that the handprints could represent a form of communication, a visual record that conveys information, though what that information might be is not fully clear. Others see it as an expression, not necessarily symbolic in a structured way, but still meaningful, a way of interacting with the environment, of engaging with the space in a way that goes beyond basic use. And all of these interpretations exist, because the evidence allows for them, but does not confirm one completely. And that uncertainty is part of what makes the site compelling, because it shows us the action, but not the full intention behind it. We see the result, but not the explanation. And that leaves space for interpretation, for thought, for connection. Because even without knowing exactly why these handprints were made, the act itself is recognizable. It is something that still happens. People still leave marks, still write names, still create signs of presence, and that continuity connects the past to the present in a very direct way. Because the impulse to leave a mark has not changed. Only the method has. And that makes these handprints feel closer, less distant, more immediate, because they reflect something that still exists. The desire to be seen, to be remembered, to leave something behind. And that is what stands out. Not just the number of prints, not just their age, but their persistence, because they have remained, through time, through change, still visible, still clear, still holding the shape of the hands that created them. And that preservation is remarkable, because pigment does not usually last this long. It fades, it erodes, it disappears. But here, under the conditions of the cave, protected from direct exposure, it has endured, allowing us to see something that would otherwise be lost. And that visibility creates a connection. Because when you look at these handprints, you are not just seeing an object, you are seeing an action, a moment, a person placing their hand against the rock, blowing pigment, stepping back, leaving something behind. And that moment is still there, captured, not as a story, but as a trace. And that trace is enough to show that this was not random, not accidental, but intentional, repeated, shared, and meaningful in a way that does not require full explanation to be understood. And maybe that is what makes it so powerful. Because even without knowing exactly why these marks were made, we understand what it means to leave one. And that understanding bridges the gap between then and now, between them and us, because the act is the same, even if everything else has changed. And that connection is what remains. The stone that was drilled with impossible precision, holes, too precise for ancient tools. At first, it sounds like an exaggeration, because drilling through stone is something we understand today. Something done with powered tools, controlled pressure, and materials designed specifically to cut through hard surfaces, so it feels natural to assume that anything similar found in the ancient world must be rough, uneven, or limited in accuracy. But the evidence challenges that assumption. Because in multiple archaeological sites around the world, there are stones with holes drilled cleanly through them, not chipped, not cracked, but shaped with a level of precision that appears controlled, deliberate, and in some cases, remarkably consistent, with smooth internal surfaces and near uniform diameters that suggest more than simple impact or basic carving techniques. And that is where the question begins. Because creating a hole through stone is not a simple task even with moderns tools, as it requires not only force but also control. The ability to maintain direction, to avoid fractures, and to produce a clean result rather than a broken surface. And doing that repeatedly suggests a method, not just effort. The stones themselves vary. Some are small, some much larger. But the feature that connects them is the presence of these drilled openings, often straight, sometimes aligned, sometimes placed in positions that suggest function, rather than decoration, indicating that the hole itself served a purpose beyond appearance, and that purpose is still debated. Because while the holes are clearly intentional, their exact use is not always obvious, leading to multiple interpretations based on context, location, and comparison with other findings. One possibility is structural, that these holes were used to hold wooden beams, supports, or connecting elements, allowing stone to be integrated into larger constructions, creating systems where different materials work together, with the stone providing stability and the inserted components providing flexibility or extension. And that idea fits in many cases, because the placement of the holes often aligns with positions where connection would be useful, suggesting that they were part of a larger design rather than isolated features. But even with that explanation, the method remains the focus, because the precision of the holes suggests control, not random force, not simple pounding, but something more consistent. And that consistency points toward technique, possibly the use of drilling methods involving rotational motion, where a tool is turned repeatedly against the surface, gradually wearing away the material, rather than breaking it apart in a single action. And that approach changes everything, because rotation requires stability, control, repetition. It requires maintaining alignment over time, ensuring that the whole continues in the intended direction without shifting. And that is not easy to achieve without some form of guiding method or experience built through repeated practice. There is also evidence that abrasives may have been used, materials like sand placed between the tool and the stone, increasing the cutting efficiency, allowing the surface to be worn down gradually rather than forced apart. And that combination of rotation and abrasive material would make the process more controlled, more predictable, and more precise. And that reflects understanding. Not theoretical in the modern sense, but practical, based on observation, on learning what works, on refining methods over time until the desired result can be achieved consistently. And consistency is key, because isolated precision can happen by chance, but repeated precision suggests knowledge. It suggests that the process was understood well enough to be applied again and again, across different stones, different locations, and possibly different groups. And that raises another question. How widespread was this knowledge? Because similar drilled stones appear in different parts of the world, which could suggest independent discovery, where different groups arrived at similar solutions through experimentation, or it could suggest some form of shared knowledge, where techniques were passed along, adapted, and maintained. And both possibilities are significant, because they reflect how human innovation develops, either through connection or through parallel thinking, where similar challenges lead to similar solutions, even without direct contact. But beyond the method and the distribution, there is the result. Because when you look at these holes, what stands out is not just that they exist, but how they look: clean, defined, controlled. Not perfect in the modern engineered sense, but precise enough to show that the process was guided, that the outcome was not left to chance. And that visual clarity creates a sense of contrast, because we expect ancient tools to leave rough marks, irregular edges, signs of struggle against the material, but instead, what we see is something more refined, something that suggests patience, time, and careful execution rather than force alone, and that challenges assumptions, because it shows that the difference between ancient and modern methods is not always about capability, but about approach, about how problems are solved using the tools and knowledge available at the time. And even now, when these stones are examined, the marks left by the drilling process can still be seen, patterns that indicate movement, direction, and technique, providing clues about how the work was done even if the exact tools are no longer present. And those clues matter, because they allow reconstruction, not of the exact moment, but of the method, of the sequence of actions that would have led to the result. And that reconstruction brings us closer to understanding, even if it does not answer every question, because some details remain uncertain. The exact tools used, the time required for each hole, the level of skill needed. All of these vary depending on interpretation. But the outcome is clear. The holes exist. They were made intentionally. And they were made with a level of control that reflects more than simple effort. And that is what remains. Not just the stone, but the evidence of process, of method, of understanding applied through action. And maybe that is what makes these objects stand out. Not because they are mysterious in an unexplained way, but because they show something that is easy to overlook. The presence of skill in a context where we often expect only simplicity. Because even without modern tools, even without advanced machinery, people were able to achieve results that still hold up under observation, still raise questions, still demonstrate that precision is not limited to any one time period. And that realization is what stays. But the burials marked in red, covered in color, for a reason lost. At first it seems like a detail that could be dismissed, because when we think about ancient burials, the focus usually falls on the body itself, the position, the objects placed alongside it, the structure of the grave. But here, something else stands out immediately, something that changes how the burial is understood. The presence of red, not faint, not accidental, but clearly applied, because in multiple burial sites across different regions and time periods, archaeologists have found human remains covered in red ochre, a natural pigment made from iron-rich earth placed deliberately over the body, sometimes concentrated in specific areas, sometimes spread more broadly, but consistently present in a way that suggests intention rather than coincidence. And that intention is what raises the question. Because applying pigment to a body is not necessary for preservation. It does not protect in a practical sense. It does not prevent decay. which means the action serves another purpose, one that is not immediately visible. The pigment itself is simple in origin. It can be found in the ground, collected, processed. But even that requires effort, because it must be gathered, possibly ground into a finer form, and then applied, which means that time and energy were invested into something that does not produce a direct physical benefit. And that investment suggests meaning, because actions that require effort without clear survival advantage are often tied to belief, to symbolism, to ideas that exist beyond immediate necessity. One of the most common interpretations is that the red color may have been associated with life, possibly representing blood, which could symbolically connect the act of burial with ideas of renewal, continuation, or transformation, suggesting that death was not seen as a complete end, but as part of a process. And that idea appears in cultures, not identical, but similar, where color, especially red, carries associations that go beyond appearance, representing concepts that are not directly visible but are expressed through action. But interpretation remains uncertain, because there are no written explanations that describe exactly why this was done, no direct records that connect the act to a specific belief system in a way that can be confirmed without doubt, which means that the meaning must be inferred based on patterns, based on repetition, based on context. And those patterns are clear because red ochre burials are not isolated. They appear in multiple locations across different time periods, suggesting that this was not a one-time practice, but something that was repeated, possibly independently in different regions, or shared through cultural contact. And that repetition is important, because it shows consistency. Not randomness, not isolated action, but a practice, something that people chose to do, again and again. And that choice reflects intention. The placement of the pigment also varies. In some cases, it is concentrated around the head, in others, across the entire body. Sometimes it appears beneath the body, sometimes above it, suggesting that the method of application could differ, but the presence itself remains consistent, and that variation adds complexity, because it suggests that while the use of ochre was shared, the exact meaning or method may have differed between groups shaped by local beliefs, local practices, and local interpretations. And that diversity makes it harder to define a single explanation, because what applies in one context may not apply in another. But even with that variation, the act itself remains clear. The body was not left as it was. It was altered, marked, given something additional. And that addition is what stands out, because it transforms the burial from a simple placement into something more deliberate, something that carries an extra layer of meaning. The environments in which these burials are found also play a role in what remains, because in some cases the pigment is preserved clearly, allowing researchers to see the distribution and intensity, while in others, only traces remain, enough to indicate presence, but not enough to fully reconstruct the original appearance. And that difference affects interpretation, because what we see now is not always a complete picture. It is what has survived. What remains after time, conditions, and change have altered the original state. But even with incomplete evidence, the pattern is strong enough to suggest that this was not incidental. It was deliberate. And that deliberateness reflects something about how people understood death, because burial itself is an action that goes beyond necessity. And adding pigment to that process adds another layer, suggesting that the act was not just about placing the body, but about doing something to it, something that carried meaning for those performing the burial. And that meaning, even if not fully understood today, was likely clear to them, because actions like this are not usually performed without understanding. They are part of a system, a way of thinking, a way of responding. And that system may have included ideas about life, death, transition, or identity, concepts that are difficult to see directly in the physical evidence, but that leave traces through repeated behavior. And that is what we are seeing. Not just pigment, but pattern. Not just color, but choice. a repeated decision to apply something that does not serve a direct physical function, but still matters enough to be done. And maybe that is what makes these burials stand out. Not because they are visually striking, but because they show that even in very early periods, people were engaging with death in ways that go beyond simple survival, adding layers of meaning that are not always easy to interpret, but are clearly present. And that presence is what remains. The figures that seem to watch back. Faces that feel like they're still observing you. At first glance, they are small, simple objects, shaped from clay, with minimal detail in a form that appears almost abstract. But the longer you look at them, the more that simplicity begins to shift into something else, something that feels deliberate in a way that is difficult to fully explain. These are the Valdivia figurines, discovered in what is now Ecuador, and they date back several thousand years, placing them among some of the earliest known ceramic figures in the Americas, created by a culture that developed along the coast and left behind objects that continue to raise questions about their purpose and meaning. The figures themselves are usually small enough to fit in the hand, with bodies that are often simplified, sometimes lacking detailed limbs, sometimes shaped in a way that emphasizes certain features over others, but what consistently stands out is the face, because the eyes are not neutral. They are wide, defined, positioned in a way that gives the impression of attention, as if the figure is not just an object to be looked at, but something that is looking back. And that impression is not accidental, because the eyes are carved or shaped with care, sometimes emphasized with incisions or added detail, creating a focal point that draws attention immediately, even when the rest of the figure remains simple. And that focus matters, because when a particular feature is emphasized repeatedly across multiple objects, it suggests intention, a decision to highlight that aspect as significant, rather than allowing all parts to carry equal weight. But the figures are not identical. They vary in size, in shape, in detail. Some appear more refined, others more rough, which suggests that they were not produced in a single controlled process, but rather created individually, possibly by different people, at different times, each one following a shared idea but expressing it slightly differently. And that variation introduces another layer, because it suggests that these were not mass-produced items, but personal or locally made objects, each carrying its own small differences, while still belonging to a recognizable group. The material itself is also important. Clay, shaped by hand, fired to create a durable form. And that process requires knowledge. Understanding how to work with the material, how to shape it without breaking, how to apply heat in a way that hardens the figure rather than destroying it. And that knowledge reflects a level of development in craftsmanship, where materials are not just used but transformed into something that can last. But the question remains, what were they for? Because these figures do not appear to serve a practical function in the usual sense. They are not tools. They do not assist in tasks. They do not provide direct utility, which means their purpose lies elsewhere. Some interpretations suggest that they may have been connected to fertility, representing the human form in a way that emphasizes certain features associated with reproduction. And that idea is supported by the fact that many of the figurines appear to represent female forms, with attention given to areas that could carry symbolic meaning. But that interpretation is not universal, because not all figures fit that pattern exactly, and without written records, the meaning remains inferred rather than confirmed. Other possibilities suggest that the figurines may have been used in rituals as objects that held symbolic value within certain practices, possibly representing individuals, ancestors, or concepts that were important within the culture. And that idea fits with how objects are often used in non-practical ways, where their value is not in what they do physically, but in what they represent. But even with these interpretations, there is no single explanation that fully accounts for all the variations, and that leaves space for uncertainty, for multiple possibilities, for meanings that may have shifted over time, because objects like this are not always fixed in purpose. They can change, adapt, be used in different ways by different people, and that fluidity makes them harder to define. But the consistency of the eyes remains. Across different figures, across different variations, that same sense of attention, of presence, of something that feels aware, and that is what gives them their distinct character. Because even though they are small and simple, they create an impression that goes beyond their size. They feel intentional, focused, as if they are meant to hold attention rather than simply exist. And that effect continues even now. Because when these figurines are displayed or studied, the first thing that stands out is not the body, not the material, but the face, the eyes. And that immediate focus suggests that the design achieved something. It created a response. It directed attention. And that direction is what defines the object, because it shows that even with simple materials and limited detail, it is possible to create something that carries presence, something that feels more than just physical. And that presence is difficult to measure. It does not appear in data. It does not leave clear evidence, but it is experienced, observed, recognized. And that recognition is what connects the object to those who see it. Because even without knowing its original purpose, the effect remains, the sense that it is not just something to look at, but something that looks back. And maybe that is what makes these figurines stand out. Not because we fully understand them, but because we don't. Because they exist in that space between object and meaning, where the form is clear but the purpose is not fully defined, leaving behind something that continues to hold attention without fully explaining itself. And that feeling is what remains. The burial meant to keep something in, a ritual meant to stop something. At first, the image is difficult to ignore, because among the remains of an otherwise typical burial, there is one detail that immediately stands out. Something that does not belong to standard burial practice and does not serve any obvious physical purpose. A brick placed inside the mouth of the skeleton, not beside it, not near it, but deliberately positioned within the jaw, as if it had been inserted before burial, placed with intention rather than accident, creating a detail that feels unsettling, not because of what it is, but because of what it suggests. This type of burial has been found in parts of Europe, particularly in regions where historical records and folklore include strong beliefs about the dead returning, about individuals who, for various reasons, were thought capable of rising again after death and causing harm to the living. And that belief changes how the burial is understood, because placing a brick in the mouth is not a random act. It is specific, targeted, focused on preventing something. But what exactly that something was is not fully defined in physical terms. It exists in belief, in interpretation, in the way people understood death and what might follow it. In many of these cases, the individuals buried in this way were not treated the same as others. There are signs that they were singled out, identified in some way as different, whether due to illness, unusual physical conditions, social factors, or events surrounding their death that made them stand apart from the rest of the community. And that distinction matters, because burial practices often reflect how a society views an individual, not just in life, but in death. And when that treatment changes, it suggests a change in perception, a shift from normal to something else, something that requires additional action. The brick itself is a simple object, common, readily available, but its placement transforms it into something else entirely, because it is not used here as a building material or a tool, but as part of a ritual, an action that carries meaning beyond its physical form. One interpretation is that it was meant to prevent the body from rising, from returning in some form by physically blocking the mouth, possibly tied to beliefs that the dead could consume, spread disease, or otherwise interact with the living in harmful ways. And that idea, while difficult to understand from a modern perspective, fits within a broader pattern of practices found in different regions, where measures were taken to limit or prevent the movement of the dead, including placing heavy objects on the body, binding limbs, or altering the burial in ways that would restrict any potential return. But the brick specifically suggests something more focused, because it targets the mouth. And the mouth carries meaning. It is associated with breath, with speech, with consumption. And blocking it could be seen as a way of stopping something from leaving or entering, a symbolic action tied to how the body was believed to function after death. But even with these interpretations, there is no single explanation that can be confirmed without doubt, because the physical evidence shows what was done, but not exactly why. There are no direct records attached to each burial that explain the reasoning in precise terms, only patterns that can be compared with known beliefs and practices from similar periods. And that leaves room for uncertainty, because interpretation depends on context, on how the burial fits within the broader cultural and historical environment, on what was believed at the time. And those beliefs are not always preserved clearly, but the repetition of similar practices across different sites suggests that this was not an isolated act. It was part of a pattern, a response to a shared idea, a way of dealing with something that was not fully understood. And that response reflects fear, not necessarily in the simple sense of being afraid, but in the sense of trying to control something uncertain, something that cannot be directly observed or proven but is still believed to exist. And that belief leads to action, because when something cannot be explained, it is often managed through ritual, through practices that provide a sense of control, even if the underlying cause is not fully understood. And that is what this burial represents, an attempt to control, to prevent, to ensure that whatever was believed to be possible would not happen. And that attempt leaves a physical trace, because the brick remains, the placement remains, the evidence of the action remains, even if the belief behind it is no longer shared in the same way. And that creates a contrast between what we see now and what was understood then. Because from a modern perspective, the act may seem unusual, even unnecessary. But within its original context, it likely made sense, it likely felt justified, it likely served a purpose within the belief system of the people who performed it. And that difference in perspective is important, because it reminds us that actions are shaped by understanding, and understanding changes over time. What seems unclear now may have been clear then. What seems symbolic now may have been practical, within a different framework of thought. And that shift is part of how history is interpreted, not just through objects, but through the meanings attached to them. And in this case, the object is simple, a brick, but the action is not, because placing it in that position transforms it into something else, something that carries intention, purpose, and belief. And that belief is what remains, even if it is no longer fully understood, even if it exists only as a possibility inferred from patterns and contexts. Because the burial itself shows that something was considered necessary, something that required intervention, something that could not be left to chance. And that sense of necessity is what stands out. Not just the object, but the decision, the act of doing something specific to prevent something unknown. And maybe that is what makes this burial so compelling. Not because it provides clear answers, but because it shows how people responded to uncertainty, how they acted in the face of something they could not fully explain, using the tools and ideas available to them at the time. And that response is what remains. The reflection that came before glass. Reflection before glass. At first, it feels like something so ordinary that it barely needs explanation, because mirrors are part of daily life, simple objects that return an image instantly, something so familiar that we rarely stop to think about how that reflection is created or how long the idea has existed. But long before glass mirrors were developed, long before reflective coatings and controlled surfaces, people were already finding ways to see themselves. And one of the earliest methods involved obsidian, a natural volcanic glass that, when shaped and polished correctly, can produce a reflective surface capable of showing an image not perfectly clear by modern standards, but recognizable enough to capture form, movement, and presence. And that ability changes everything, because a reflection is not just visual, it is conceptual. Seeing yourself is different from seeing others. It introduces awareness, recognition, the ability to observe your own form as something separate from your immediate experience. And that shift carries meaning because it allows for a different kind of interaction, not just with the world, but with the self. The process of creating an obsidian mirror is not simple, even though the material itself occurs naturally. Because while raw obsidian can be sharp and smooth in places, it does not automatically provide a clear reflection. It must be shaped, refined, polished over time. And that polishing process requires patience, because achieving a reflective surface depends on removing imperfections, smoothing the material gradually until it can reflect light in a consistent way. And that takes effort, repeated action, careful handling. Because obsidian, while capable of becoming extremely sharp and smooth, is also fragile, prone to chipping or cracking if handled incorrectly, which means that working with it requires control, not just force. And that control reflects knowledge, not theoretical in the modern sense, but practical, built through experience, through understanding how the material behaves, how it responds to pressure, to friction, to time. And that understanding allows the creation of something that goes beyond basic utility. Because a mirror is not a tool in the same way as a blade or a hammer. It does not directly alter the environment. It does not cut, build, or shape. It reflects, and that reflection serves a different purpose. One that is more subtle, more abstract, but still significant. In many ancient cultures, reflective surfaces were not only used for practical reasons, such as grooming or personal appearance, but also held symbolic or ritual significance, sometimes associated with observation, with insight, with the idea of seeing beyond the immediate surface. And that possibility adds another layer, because it suggests that the mirror may not have been just an object for viewing. It may have been an object for a meaning, something that carried value beyond its physical function. And that value is often reflected in how such objects are treated, because obsidian mirrors have been found in contexts that suggest importance, sometimes placed in burials, sometimes associated with individuals of higher status, indicating that they were not common items but objects that held significance within the society. And that significance could take many forms: practical, symbolic, social, because objects that allow for self-observation can influence how individuals present themselves, how they understand their appearance, how they interact with others. And that influence, even if subtle, becomes part of the culture, part of how people experience themselves. But even without those broader interpretations, the object itself is enough to show something important. Because creating a reflective surface from obsidian requires more than just recognizing that it can reflect. It requires developing a method to enhance that property, to turn a natural material into something that performs a specific function reliably. And that transformation is what defines technology. Not the complexity of the material, but the application of knowledge to create a desired result. And that result, in this case, is reflection. A surface that returns an image. Not perfectly. Not in high clarity, but clearly enough to be recognized. And that recognition is powerful, because it creates a moment. A moment where the observer becomes the observed, where the line between subject and object shifts, even if only briefly. And that experience is something that still exists today, even if the tools have changed, because the act of looking into a mirror has not fundamentally changed. Only the clarity has. The materials have, the accessibility has, but the concept remains the same, and that continuity connects the past to the present in a very direct way. Because when you look at an obsidian mirror, you are not just looking at an object, you are looking at an early version of something that still exists, still used, still part of daily life. And that connection makes it easier to understand, because it is familiar, even if the material is not, even if the context is different. The function is recognizable, and that recognition bridges the gap between then and now, between early understanding and modern application, because it shows that the idea of reflection, of seeing oneself, is not new. It has existed for a very long time, developed in different ways, using different materials, but always connected to the same core concept. And that concept is what remains. Not just the object, but the ability. The ability to see, to observe, to recognize. And that ability is what stays. The doors that were never meant to open. Perfect doors, carved into solid rock. At first glance, they look familiar because the shape is immediately recognizable. A rectangular frame, clean edges, proportions that resemble an actual doorway. Something that appears functional, something that seems like it should lead somewhere, but it doesn't. Because these doors are not openings, they are carved directly into solid rock with no passage behind them, no space beyond the frame, no interior to enter, just the surface itself shaped in a way that imitates a door without ever becoming one. And that contradiction is what makes them stand out. Because doors are meant to connect spaces, to allow movement, to create access. But here, that function is removed. The form remains, the purpose does not. These structures are often found in regions of Peru, associated with ancient cultures that worked extensively with stone, shaping it with a level of precision that still draws attention, not only for the scale of their constructions, but also for the detail of their carving. And these false doors are part of that detail. They are not rough. They are not incomplete. They are carefully made, with smooth surfaces, defined frames, sometimes even recessed sections that mimic the depth of an actual doorway, creating the illusion of an entrance that is not there. And that illusion raises a question. Why create something that looks functional but is not? Because carving into stone requires effort, time, planning. It is not something done casually. And when that effort is directed toward creating a form that serves no practical purpose, it suggests that the purpose lies elsewhere, not in use, but in meaning. One interpretation is that these false doors may have had symbolic significance, possibly representing a boundary between different states of existence, such as the physical and the spiritual, the living and the dead, the visible and the unseen. And that idea fits within a broader pattern, because in many ancient cultures, architectural forms are not always purely functional. They can also represent concepts, ideas that are expressed through structure rather than words. A door, in that context, becomes more than an entry point. It becomes a symbol of transition, of passage, even if that passage is not physical. And that possibility is supported by the fact that some of these carved doors are found in locations that are not easily accessible or practical for daily use, suggesting that they were not intended to serve as regular pathways, but rather as markers, as elements within a space that carried meaning beyond movement. But even with that interpretation, the precision of the carving remains a key detail, because the edges are clean, the proportions are consistent. The surfaces are smooth in ways that suggest control, not just force, and that level of control indicates skill, understanding, the ability to shape stone in a way that follows a plan, and that plan includes details that are not necessary for simple marking. Because if the goal were only to indicate a location, a basic shape would be enough. But here, the form is refined, recognizable, deliberate. And that suggests that the appearance itself was important, that the resemblance to a real door was part of the intention, and that resemblance creates a kind of tension, because the viewer expects function, expects an opening, but finds none. And that difference forces a shift in perception, from practical to symbolic, from expectation to interpretation. And that shift is part of the experience. Because encountering something that looks familiar but behaves differently creates a moment of pause, a moment of questioning. And that moment may have been intentional, part of how the structure was meant to be experienced, not just seen, but considered. There is also the possibility that these carved doors were connected to burial practices, acting as symbolic entrances for the spirit of the deceased, providing a way to represent passage without physically altering the structure of the rock. And that idea aligns with how architectural elements are often used in funerary contexts, where representation can carry as much meaning as function. But again, there is no single explanation that applies to all examples, because the context varies, the location varies, and without direct records, interpretation remains based on patterns rather than confirmation, and that leaves space for multiple possibilities, for meanings that may have changed over time, for uses that are not fully preserved. But the physical evidence remains clear. These are not accidental shapes, they are carved, deliberately, with attention to form, with attention to proportion, with attention to detail, and that attention reflects intention. Because shaping stone at this level requires effort, and effort is directed. It is not applied without purpose, even if that purpose is not immediately visible. And that is where the mystery stays, not in the existence of the doors, but in their meaning. Because we can see what was made, we can understand how it was made, but the reason behind it is not fully recorded. And that gap is what keeps the question open. Why create a door that cannot open? Why shape something that imitates function without providing it? And maybe the answer lies not in what the door does physically, but in what it represents, because not all structures are meant to be used in a practical sense. Some are meant to be understood, interpreted, experienced. And that experience is what remains. The stone table that was never meant for dining. A table. But for giants? At first, that comparison feels almost automatic, because when you see these structures, the shape immediately suggests something familiar. A flat surface, supported by upright stones, forming a shape that resembles a table on a scale far larger than anything built for ordinary use, but that resemblance is misleading. Because these are not tables, they are dolmens. Ancient structures made from massive stones, typically consisting of large vertical supports, holding up an even larger horizontal slab, creating a form that has survived for thousands of years in open landscapes where little else remains. And that survival is part of what makes them so striking. Because unlike buildings that collapse, or materials that decay, these structures endure, standing in fields, on hills, sometimes isolated, sometimes grouped, but always present in a way that draws attention, not just because of their size, but because of their simplicity. And that simplicity raises a question. Because placing one large stone on top of others is not a small task, it requires planning, coordination, and the ability to move materials that are far beyond the capacity of a single individual, especially without modern tools. And that effort suggests purpose, because structures that require that level of work are not created without reason. But the reason is not always obvious, because dolmens do not provide shelter. They do not function as homes. They do not enclose space in the way buildings do, which means their purpose lies elsewhere. Most interpretations suggest that dolmens were used as burial sites, often serving as chambers where the remains of individuals were placed, either beneath the structure or within a space created by the arrangement of the stones. And that idea is supported by archaeological evidence found in some locations, where human remains, artifacts, or traces of burial activity have been discovered in association with these structures. But even within that interpretation, there is variation, because not all dolmens contain clear evidence of burial, and the way they are constructed can differ, suggesting that while they may share a general function, the specifics could vary depending on the culture, the location, and the time period. And that variation adds complexity, because it shows that these structures are not identical in purpose, even if they share a common form. But the form itself is important, because it is consistent. Large stones, vertical supports, horizontal capstone. And that repetition suggests a shared idea, a design that was understood and applied across different regions, sometimes separated by significant distances, which raises the possibility of cultural connection or independent development based on similar needs and solutions. And that question remains open, because both explanations are possible and both reflect different aspects of how human societies develop. But beyond the function, there is the experience of the structure itself, because standing near a dolmen creates a sense of scale that is difficult to ignore. The size of the stones, the weight they represent, the effort required to place them, all of which contribute to an impression that goes beyond simple observation. It feels intentional, deliberate, not just in construction, but in presence. Because these structures are not hidden, they are placed in locations where they can be seen, where they stand out against the landscape, creating a point of focus, something that defines the space around it. And that visibility suggests that they were meant to be noticed, not just used, but recognized as markers, as places, as something that holds significance, and that significance may not be limited to burial, because structures often carry multiple meanings. They can serve a practical function while also representing something symbolic, something that connects the physical space to ideas, to beliefs, to concepts that are not directly visible. And that possibility exists here as well, because the act of placing a large stone above ground level, supported in a way that creates a defined space beneath, can be seen as creating a boundary, a separation between what is above and what is below, between different states, different conditions. And that interpretation aligns with how many ancient structures are understood, not just as physical constructions, but as representations of ideas expressed through material and form. But even with these interpretations, there is no single explanation that applies to all dolmens, because the evidence varies, the context differs, and without written records, much of the meaning remains inferred rather than confirmed. And that leaves space for uncertainty, for multiple possibilities, for interpretations that evolve as new evidence is found, but the physical presence remains constant. The stones, the structure, the form, and that form continues to stand even as everything around it changes. And that endurance is part of what gives these structures their impact, because they represent something that has lasted, not just physically, but conceptually. A design that was created, repeated, and maintained across time. And that continuity suggests that the idea behind it was strong enough to persist, strong enough to be used again and again. And that persistence is what connects different sites, different cultures, different times. Because even if the specific meanings vary, the structure itself remains recognizable. And that recognition bridges the gap between past and present. Because when you see a dolmen, you understand its form immediately, even if you do not fully understand its purpose. And that understanding is enough to create connection. Because it shows that even thousands of years ago, people were creating structures that still communicate something today. Not through words, but through form, through scale, through presence. And maybe that is what makes them stand out. Not because they are mysterious in a way that cannot be approached, but because they are simple in a way that invites interpretation, offering just enough information to be understood, but not enough to be fully explained. And that balance is what remains. The faces that emerge from the mountain. You don't see them until you're close. At first, the surface of the mountain looks ordinary, just another stretch of rock shaped by time, weather, and natural erosion, with no immediate sign that anything unusual is present, nothing that clearly stands out as intentional or constructed. But as you move closer, the perception begins to change, because what once looked random starts to take on form, edges begin to align, shadows begin to define shapes, and slowly, almost gradually, something recognizable starts to appear within the stone itself. A face, or what looks like one. And then another. Not perfectly clear, not sharply defined like modern carvings, but present enough to be noticed, once the eye adjusts, once the pattern becomes visible. And that moment is what makes it compelling, because it feels like discovery, not something that is immediately given, but something that reveals itself over time, requiring attention, requiring perspective. And that raises the central question: are these faces intentional? Or are they the result of natural processes that happen to resemble something familiar? Because the human mind is naturally drawn to patterns, especially faces, recognizing them even in abstract forms, in clouds, in shadows, in surfaces that were never shaped with that purpose. And that tendency, known as pareidolia, complicates interpretation, because it means that not every face we see was meant to be one. But in some cases, the patterns go beyond coincidence. The alignment of features, the placement of shapes, the consistency across different sections, all of these can suggest intention, especially when the formations appear in locations that are otherwise unlikely to produce such specific arrangements purely through natural erosion. And that is where the debate begins. Because in some regions, there are rock formations that resemble faces with enough clarity to raise the possibility that they were shaped, at least partially, by human action, modified or enhanced to bring out features that were already present in the natural rock. And that idea introduces a different way of thinking about construction. Because instead of creating something entirely from scratch, the approach would involve working with what already exists, recognizing patterns within the natural form and refining them, adjusting the surface to emphasize certain features while leaving others unchanged. And that method would require observation, understanding, the ability to see potential within the material, not just as it is, but as it could be shaped. And that kind of perception is not simple. It requires looking beyond the immediate surface, imagining form within irregular shapes, and then applying effort in a way that brings that form into clearer definition. But even with that possibility, certainty remains difficult, because distinguishing between natural formation and intentional shaping is not always clear, especially when the features are not sharply defined, when they exist in a space between randomness and design. And that uncertainty is part of what gives these formations their impact, because they exist at that boundary between natural and artificial, between coincidence and intention, and that boundary invites interpretation. Some see them as evidence of ancient modification, of people interacting with the landscape in a way that leaves subtle traces rather than obvious construction. Others see them as purely natural, shaped by erosion, weathering, and the natural tendency of rock to fracture and wear in ways that sometimes resemble familiar forms. And both perspectives rely on observation, on how the shapes are read, on what details are emphasized, and that makes the interpretation flexible, because it depends on how the viewer engages with the structure. But beyond the question of origin, there is the experience itself. Why? Because seeing a face emerge from stone, whether natural or shaped, creates a different kind of interaction with the environment. It transforms the landscape, turns it from something passive into something that feels active, something that appears to observe rather than simply exist. And that shift is psychological, because the presence of a face changes how we relate to an object. It introduces a sense of awareness, even if that awareness is not real. And that effect may have been significant, especially in earlier contexts where natural features were often interpreted as carrying meaning, as representing something beyond their physical form. And that interpretation could turn a rock formation into something more, a marker, a symbol, a presence, something that holds attention, something that defines a place. And even if the faces were not intentionally carved, the fact that they are recognized, that they stand out, that they create a reaction gives them a form of significance that goes beyond their origin. Because meaning is not only created through intention, it can also emerge through perception, through how something is seen, how it is understood. And that understanding can change over time. What one group sees as natural, another may see as meaningful. What one period interprets as coincidence, another may interpret as design. And that fluidity is part of how such formations are experienced, because they do not have a fixed explanation. They exist in that space where observation and interpretation meet. And that is where their impact lies, not in certainty, but in possibility. Because they invite questions, encourage observation, create moments where the familiar appears in unexpected places. And that experience is what remains, not just the stone, not just the shape, but the moment of recognition. The moment where something hidden becomes visible, and that moment is what stays.